Добрий день.
Welcome everybody who have joined us today. Media Ukraine Center continues its work on the 197th day of the Russian aggression. I would like to appreciate the work of the journalists talking about this war and heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people. I would like to introduce to you the Deputy Minister of the Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine, Ms. Halyna Hryhorenko. Let us talk about the grant programs for the creative industries. What is the opening opportunity for them? Welcome. I would like to begin not with the specific steps, but the narratives that we continue to reiterate when talking to our colleagues from abroad and Ukrainian ministries. The first thing in supporting the Ukrainian culture is in material framework and all possible kinds of support, all the damage that the Ukrainian culture is suffering currently is physical infrastructure. More than 900 cultural facilities have been either destroyed or damaged, including 500 architectural sites. The culture Ukrainian institutions are suffering from the lack of personnel and the restrictions on the different theaters, for example, is caused by a number of the housing ability and a number of spectators to be allowed in, both locally and in terms of the money received from the budget. On the other hand, we see the expenses growing for the communal services to build the shelters for them to continue working. Some of the cultural facilities have been removed from the occupied territories. For example, Kherson Dramatic Theater is working in the so-called exile in Kiev on the basis of the Lesser Ukrainka Theater. Luhansk Dramatic Theater and continues to work in the western part of Ukraine. The Luhansk Philharmonics is working in the city of Lviv. What we understand now is this: for the Ukrainian culture to continue working is conditioned on the financial support from abroad. We are forced to pay salaries to come up with a new cultural product. You need money for that. Unfortunately, Ukrainian state cannot safeguard that. The economy is going down, and this is not facilitating the state's ability to support Ukrainian culture. More to the point, we know that up to 20% of the employees of this sphere are either abroad or have changed their field of work or are in the armed forces. We are losing people that have been very professional, leading to a situation that the renewal of this cultural sphere will be very difficult. Financial sphere, of course, is important. It can be done in a number of ways, including the grants for the creative industries. For example, today we have seen something being implemented through the UNESCO program and helped by a number of international bodies, including USAID, who are helping the cultural spheres of Ukraine. We have introduced those programs a couple of days ago, implying the relocation of business, bringing in new employees, the online activities for people who have fled the war. Without those people, we cannot continue working. Sphere is the realm of actions where you need money. In our negotiations with the international partners, including the ministers' visit to France, Germany, and the UK, we stress the point that up to 90% of the cultural employees are staying in Ukraine. For them to continue working, they need to be paid for. These programs might be in different ways, either fellowship or scholarship or grants to the institutions that are working in this area. Again, these might be scholarships, money for the business trips abroad, and so on. We are also talking about the need to support the physical infrastructure, especially when we are facing the cold period. The cultural facilities that have been destroyed with no windows, with no doors, before the war sets in, if we fail to preserve them, they will be ruined. We have gathered all the requests from different institutions. Today, that includes 80,000 square meters of windows, that it's not only glass but other different covering materials. Electrical generators. We know that the critical infrastructure is being damaged. Electricity is not always available, and the cultural facilities include libraries, museums, archives, musical instruments, that they will not survive the cold winter time. We will lose them at the end of the day. This material hope is very important. It can be done through the in-kind input. Not about money, but rather bringing in this wrap materials, fire extinguishers, all the pieces of equipment we need to live through the winter time. That's the first point. Second important issue is the strengthening of the horizontal interaction. Something can be done by the ministry, but the face-to-face cooperation, festival to festival, museum to museum, is a long-term activity that must be launched now. What can we offer to the world? What can the world offer to us? Not for this interaction to be sustainable for the long haul. We've been talking about that before. These ties must be set up. They are always based on individual acquaintances, on the trust for a future cooperation to thrive. This is the direction where we want to facilitate. We are not managing the process, but rather acting as facilitators. As I have mentioned, there is an issue of empowering cultural institutions within the country, beginning with the foreign language competency in the first place, and secondly, agreeing on the horizon of planning. In Ukraine, the planning is from today for tomorrow. Every day has its own needs, and there are some urgent situations. In the West, the planning horizon is from 3 to 5 to 7 years, meaning that if you want to put up an exhibition of modern art or the history of the Ukrainian art in the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum, it must be planned today, laying the groundwork for something to happen in 7 years' time. So it's a long-term planning, but urgent needs must also be taken care of. This is a parallel process, and important and complex. We are engaged in that, and we call on our partners to join in. You mentioned the horizontal ties. I think they are working in a very good way at the level of the international level within the country. We see that theaters are leaving occupied territories and going to the free territories. How about the international cooperation? Do our foreign friends want, or are they ready to host our theaters? Are they going their way? Are they ready to host our cultural figures, jumping the queue, as it were? Over the last period of time, it has happened. Indeed, this is what I called an immediate response. They are hosting us, organizing different events. Poland, for example, have been very dramatically helping us since the beginning of September, that saw the performances of the exclusively Ukrainian theaters. Our international partners, for example, the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra and Ukrainian musicians. This is unprecedented tour of the Ukrainian music throughout the world in different stages of the world. But these are all short-term projects. For them to be sustainable, that requires financial input. Of course, our friends are ready to help us, but they're now planning for the years 2023, 24, 25. We want to squeeze into their programs to be able to work in the future. Of course, the response to war is very helpful from the West, but we want to build on this groundwork. When you talked about the conservation of the ruined facilities, have this process been launched? We have begun with the assessment of what must be done. It's one thing to express the amount of money we need, but the other thing is when it comes down to implementation. Our partners want to see very transparent documentation to begin work. We want to know what houses must be roofed, where doors must be put in, where windows must be installed. So we want to see specific steps to be taken to preserve every cultural facilities, and they are all different. A library in Chernihiv was almost completely ruined. The other thing is when we don't have the windows because of the blast. We are working on this, but it must be a very detailed and thorough work because our partners want us to be responsible, and they need information, documentation to prove what has been done, how it has been done, what money has been spent for specific purposes. Questions from the floor, please. Tkachuk Svetlana from Ukrinform. With your permission, I will begin a number of issues. First question is for preparation for winter. Which facilities will be prioritized? The priorities, of course, go for the frontline regions, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and of course Mykolaiv and Donetsk oblasts. That is to say, those that are closer to the front line. They have suffered immense devastation. Sometimes the 15%, at the level of 50% of the damages. The second priority is central Ukraine and western part of Ukraine. This is where we need generators if some networks are hit or struck and there is no electricity available. We need for that kind of equipment, but priority is in the east of the country. Another clarification has to do with the creative industries. We know that when it comes to the money received, the advertisement industry has suffered most. How does in that sector been inviting money from abroad? It's not about advertising, book publishing, architecture, design industry. All of these areas need to be aided. They have lost their market share. There is a dramatic drop in demand. 40% of their personnel have been unemployed. We had, before there were thousands of people producing up to 4% of the Ukrainian GDP. 40% out of these people are jobless now. They cannot make money from the activities they were used to. We need to relocate the business. We need to create new products and create new platforms in search of the market share. We are talking about foreign partners. The advertising industry implies creativity. They are competitive on the world stage. And of course, we're talking about the concert industry. In Ukraine, it's virtually dysfunctional. We see the concerts are taking place in the metro stations, in hospitals, at the front line. So these people need to be helped. Their activities must be promoted, even at the time when the war ends. As for the advertising industry in Kiev and in Lviv, foreign companies were shooting their advertising campaigns. Is there a continuous work? You know, the safety issue is very important. It's very difficult to engage them to work in Ukraine. We want to show that this area is not dead. We are not trying to hide in the shelters. We want to engage more and more people. Journalists are coming. Authors of the documentary movies are coming. But to have people coming to Ukraine from big advertising companies is very difficult. They have health insurances, and this is the matter of safety is a priority for them. So realistically speaking, we can't expect them to come here in droves. The last question has to do with the information on international stage. Now that the war is into the 7th month, how does your industry respond to that kind of war? How many countries, for example, Germany, are allocating money for the Russian opposition? Now, unfortunately, we see that the Russian propaganda is not perceived as a propaganda. All our efforts to block Russian propaganda, for example, through the cultural events, we don't see the understanding from our foreign partners. What we are trying to say that this poisons the international media, that the Russian narratives are spoiling and are working to the detriment of the Russian consciousness. You saw how much time it took to discontinue Russia Today broadcasting. It implies a lot of efforts. Europe seems to understand us in a lot of ways, but they don't seem to share the view that the Russian culture is dangerous, it is weaponized. You know that the Russian president has signed a decree on the concept of their foreign activities, where it is in black and white, saying that through the culture they will promote their ideology. The head of one of the Russian leading museums said that their exhibition in France is serving the Russian propaganda. Of course, we cannot impose our position on the foreign media. We don't want to dictate their governments where to spend money on, but we will not accept the point what they call an aid to Ukraine when they are banning Russia for Today channels, for example, rather than assimilate and accept them in the opposition leaders in their territories. Of course, this is a gray area. This is not black and white matter. When we're talking about the psychological adaptation for women, for children, very specific. How specific can you be in this realm? We are cooperating with UNESCO. They have a number of programs on mental and psychological situation and different diseases. For example, women who have left the country with their children, and if children must be going to school, and it decreases the possibility of these school children coming back to Ukraine. Now the issue arises how to make sure that these people will return to Ukraine. In Croatia, we set up a summer camp to overcome psychological issues, to overcome traumatic syndromes. And I think our cultural managers have received a toolbox of how to work with such diseases. How this work can be done in Ukrainian schools? I think that the culture sphere is exactly the way to do that kind of work safely, not go into the medical sphere, but rather psychological one, where we'll increase the share of cultural and humanitarian subjects in the school's curricula. This is where we want to advocate this agenda. More often than not, both children and educators say that foreign languages, sciences, and other subjects are more important. What we are trying to say is that humanitarian field is very important. It promotes the adequacy of your responses and other psychological problems for children to be suffered in the future. International Anti-Corruption Assembly. I've got two questions to you. Has your ministry been part in an effort to return the money, to retrieve the money received from the freezed assets in the United States? Unfortunately, this is not exactly our remit. I think that Ministry of the Interior, of the Foreign Affairs, and other law enforcement institutions are working on that. But what we are trying to do is to prevent the outflow of the cultural objects abroad. The UNESCO has come up with a red list of artworks that might find their way to the illegal markets, and then we will deal with the issue of returning those cultural objects to Ukraine. Do we understand now whether the Ukrainian cultural heritage has been taken away to Russia, for example? Do we know the scope of such damages? Do we know a register of such like issues? I will begin with the register. The museum fund has not been digitized even before the war, and my colleagues at the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy are working on this. We want to digitize that register to know what we are losing. The information from the occupied territories is not available, and what we know is only from public domain. This is what the ordinary Ukrainians know. But you know, it's difficult to identify when you see something on the screen whether this is exactly the particular artwork. This is a situation where we don't have the full scope of knowledge. I think after the war we will digitize the paper archives, and then we will know what the damages have been. Let me remind you that we have been hosted by Halyna Hryhorenko, the Deputy Minister for Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine, and we thank her. At 13:30 we will have Jaime Hunter, the expert from the World Health Organization. We'll be talking about the mental health. Stay tuned.